Greetings, animals. Welcome back. Episode 2 of our Let's Read series of the book More Equal Animals. Give me one moment just to make sure that all of the streams we have going have the link to this stream over on Odysee. If you're watching on YouTube, the link is in the description. If you're watching anywhere else, you should have the link now. And I should be able to see all the chat from all the different places. So, there we go. All right. How is everyone? I hope you're enjoying this book. I definitely have enjoyed it. And I am enjoying my second read through of it. I just need to make sure that I have my pen and highlighter ready. And we will get started. So just again, another reminder. This series is not like the morning think times. This series, I do keep an eye on chat, and I'm happy to interact with you guys and take questions and comments and things like that as we go through reading this book. All right. We are at the chapter entitled Rules of Relative Power. Let's get started. Have you ever felt like your vote doesn't matter? In a large group, the odds that your vote makes a difference is like the odds of getting struck by lightning. In fact, the outcome of an election is a populous... My goodness, this is going to be difficult if I can't read any better than this. In fact, the outcome of an election in a populous country is more likely to be decided by voters randomly hospitalized in car accidents on the way to cast their vote. If your vote wasn't next to worthless already, the larger the voting population, the greater the opportunity for voting fraud, and the harder fraud is to detect. That said, in small groups, a single vote is much more likely to be the deciding factor, and the vote counting is much less likely to be fraudulent. Traditional democratic processes break down at scale due to the gap between the power of an individual and the power the people collectively yield to their government, or the power the government collectively assumes by fiat. The larger a community grows, the more difficult it becomes for an individual or minority to negotiate and enforce a peace treaty with all the other members. What's up, Outlaw? You have to work tonight? No problem. Yes, it is on Odysee, and after the way Odysee live streams work is after the live stream's over, I have to upload my recording of it to the same address. So it's not available instantly. Sometimes it's like an hour before I can transcode it and upload it. So if you miss the live stream over on Odysee and it still shows like it's supposed to be a live stream, just like give it an hour and the upload should be done. That's how Odyssey is currently working. Okay. Traditional democratic processes break down at scale due to the gap between the power of an individual and the power of a people collectively yield to their government. The larger a community grows, the more difficult it becomes for an individual or minority to negotiate and enforce a peace treaty with all the other members. Small groups, the size of a family, can easily vote or compromise by other means. Reputation and voluntary membership balance the game theory and minimize impact of moral hazard. I discuss moral hazard in greater detail in Chapter 10. In the event of a dispute within a small group, an individual has many options under the law of the jungle to negotiate, enforce, or leave a peace treaty. Larger communities of under 150 people can operate traditional democracies or even dictatorships, but the individual is unlikely to have any hope to utilize the law of the jungle to negotiate and enforce his interpretation of the peace treaty. Instead, individuals must organize small groups, a couple dozen people, in order to enforce the treaty. Since it is reasonable for the typical individual to have a couple of dozen friends and family, it is unlikely for a democracy of 150 people to become too oppressive. Even if someone has no friends, he has an option to leave the community and find another community that he feels will honor a reasonable peace treaty. Fortunately, there is potential for countless communities of 150 people. As communities get larger, the individual has extremely limited power to negotiate relative to the community. In a dispute over rights, violation of the peace treaty, an individual faces much greater costs of moving to a new community, and the number of alternative communities shrinks dramatically. At a global scale, an individual has almost no power and has no escape in the event of a dispute over his individual rights. It is for this reason that any democratic system of government must protect the ability of individuals to cooperate to reach a new consensus. If a global system is captured by corrupt political parties and refuses to recognize the right of individuals to secede from the group, then individuals are left no choice but to apply the law of the jungle in a violent guerrilla terrorist revolution until a new peace treaty can be negotiated and respected by all. British anthropologist Robin Dunbar discovered that there are natural biological limits to the number of people any individual can form a cohesive social group with. Dunbar found that groups can grow to about 150 people before they split off or collapse. For anarchists, it's probably like 10. Researchers found that this rule holds for all kinds of groupings, from hunter-gatherer societies to factories to military organizations and Amish communities. It seems wise to factor in this natural tribal relationship between individuals and groups when forming governance structures or negotiating peace treaties. Secession. One of the most important properties of a true democracy is the right of members to secede from the group. Failure to plan for and maintain the ability to secede is planning for a democracy to evolve into tyranny. It is like going into a marriage with a prenuptial to avoid a messy divorce. And in the case of the states in this country, even when you do say that you have the right to secede, people tend to ignore that when they don't want you to secede. The power of an individual to secede depends upon what resources they are able to take with them. If all the land of the earth belongs to a corrupt society, then secession is death. If you are forced to secede to the wild as an individual, but you lack the skills to live in the wild, then it is also death. In practice, individuals need the power to secede in groups, and those groups need to be relatively independent. The only way to ensure that society is organized in such a way that secession is viable is to group by geography. This would look like a federation of microstates. Now, just let me think about this for a minute, this paragraph. The power of an individual to secede depends on what resources they're able to take with them. Secession is death if there's nowhere for them to go. If you don't have the skills to live on your own, then seceding is also death. In practice, individuals need the power to secede in groups, and those groups need to be relatively independent. The only way to ensure that society is organized in such a way that secession is viable is to group by geography. I don't see how you could call something consensual secession if you have to walk away from your real estate property to do so. That seems to be a problem with this conception. It is incapable of respecting property rights if to secede I have to abandon my property. Just something I'm keeping in the back of my mind. Let's continue. Each group would need the ability to reach consensus to secede and retain the internal autonomy to make it feasible. Any community that loses its ability to be relatively self-sufficient effectively loses its ability to secede and becomes subject to a foreign governance structure. Effectively loses its ability to secede. I don't know if this is an accurate way of saying it. Any community that loses its ability to be relatively self-sufficient. Loses its ability to be it depends on why that is. If it's all voluntary, then it's not. Then it's a voluntary dependence. And while that may be dumb, there's no harm. There's no sort of NAP violation or coercion going on there. There's no victim and no aggressor in that situation. You know, when we voluntarily choose to make ourselves dependent on other people, there is neither a victim nor an oppressor. It can still be a dumb decision. Freedom entails the freedom to make dumb decisions. And people definitely will, right? All right, moving on. A community doesn't have to be fully self-sufficient so long as there are ample alternative suppliers of things it needs. In addition to being relatively autonomous, each community would have to maintain sufficient, quote, jungle power relative to other communities to maintain fair negotiations. This jungle power could be derived by alliances with other tribes for the express purpose of defending their right to secede, or it could be a powerful military. The United States is a case study in the intended democracy of states being lost due to failure to retain internal autonomy. The Union of the American States was supposed to be voluntary, with each state having the right to peacefully leave the Union. 3 states, New York, Rhode Island, and Virginia. It looks like there's a typo there. 3 states, New York, Rhode Island, and Virginia, explicitly documented the right of secession in their ratification documents. Since these 3 states were accepted into the Union, we should presume that other states same rights. The New York ratification document of July 26, 1788 says, quote, that the powers of government, in Article 1, Section 8, may be reassumed by the people whensoever it shall become necessary to their happiness, that every power, jurisdiction, and right, which is not by the said Constitution clearly delegated to the Congress of the United States or the departments of the government thereof, remains to the people of the several states or to their respective state governments to whom they may have granted the same. End quote. The May 29, 1790 ratification document of Rhode Island was very similar. Quote, that the powers of government may be resumed by the people whensoever it shall become necessary to their happiness. End quote. And the June 26, 1788 Virginia ratification document reads, quote, the powers granted under the Constitution being derived from the people of the United States may be resumed by them whensoever the same powers shall be perverted to their injury or oppression, and that every power not granted thereby remains with them and at their will. End quote. The war between the states was fought to prevent secession and not to abolish slavery as commonly taught. In August 1862, Lincoln stated, quote, if I could save the Union without freeing any slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. End quote. 6 months later, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation that only freed slaves in the South. This quote single-handedly demonstrates how the individual states in the, quote, democracy of United States lost the presumed right to secede as documented in their ratification documents. They didn't lose it, it was taken. It was taken. You don't lose rights. The southern states lacked sufficient jungle power and economic autonomy to enforce the peace treaty known as the Constitution of the United States. In the context of the United States, this would look like all states having an equal vote regardless of their population, and all states having comparable jungle power. The Constitution should explicitly establish the right of secession. A federation of states that are unequally yoked is not stable. It would be like a community consisting of an adult and many babies. There is no ability to negotiate community-to-community peace treaties among communities of vastly different sizes and capabilities. The larger community can hold a smaller community in an abusive relationship and extort unbalanced terms of peace. Maybe, I don't know if extortion is an appropriate word, but I mean, I'm sure there's some circumstance that I'm not thinking of. The lesson we can take from this is that democracy only works among relatively independent equals and only at a small scale. If we want to build larger democratic systems, then they must be constructed to respect the law of relative power. One way to do this is to organize governance into a hierarchy of relatively equal organizations. Individuals should be members of a family. Families should be members of a church or social club. Churches should be members of a town. Towns should be members of a county. And counties should be members of a state. The size difference of families versus families, churches versus churches, towns versus towns, and counties versus counties should be minimized. Likewise, the number of members in each horizontal level should be minimized. If you don't want a, quote, democratic county of 10,000 churches anymore, you don't want a, quote, democratic county of 10,000 churches any more than you would want a church of 10,000 families or a family of 10,000 people. Left to natural processes, the size of churches, towns, cities, states, and counties follows a Pareto distribution. 80% of the people live in 20% of the cities, and 51% of the people live in 1% of the cities. There are orders of magnitude difference in size between the largest and smallest state, city, church, etc. This means that New York City and Roanoke cannot be peers in the governance process, nor can California and Iowa, unless California is willing to give Iowa equal vote, and they have all similar military capabilities to level the playing field in the event Iowa wishes to secede. If the citizens of California wish to have more power at the federal level, then California would have to divide itself into multiple autonomous pieces of similar size and power to Iowa. Furthermore, precautions must be made to prevent the newly autonomous parts of California from colluding, forming a party to act as one unit. A subsequent chapter will address the need to utilize the power of randomness to prevent collusive parties. The United States would have to reject states that are too small, or at the extreme, you could have an individual person applying to be a member with equal voting rights to the entire state of California. Stated another way, all democracies, whether of people or of states, must consent to the addition of new members and allow the unilateral voluntary secession of any member. I'm going to read that again. Stated another way, all democracies, whether of people or of states, must consent to the addition of new members and allow the unilateral voluntary secession of any member. Okay, what he is describing is not democracy in any form that has ever existed. Really needs to use a different word than democracy. No democracy has ever functioned like that ever. Maybe he's trying to make the case that that should be how all democracies function. Fine, but man, this word has been perverted. If that's the case, the word's been perverted. More likely, we already have a label for everything that's ever been a democracy, and it it never involves consent to the addition of new members and never allows unilateral secession of members. A democracy has never been voluntary. What he's describing is something new and different. It's not a crassy democracy rule by the demos, the people. Rule by the people. It's not rule. There's not coercion. There's not rule, a cratic, if it's consensual. Maybe there just needs to be a different word entirely. Maybe I've got the etymology of democracy wrong. There are not objective meanings of words. I understand that. And it's good that he's talking about a consensual democracy. That's really good. That makes me continue reading the book as opposed to shedding it and moving on with my life. It's just, okay. Anyway, I'm going to stop harping on democracy, or I'm going to attempt to stop harping on democracy for the rest of the book. I think I've made the point. Any system that rewards concentration and centralization will tend toward larger and larger institutions. Economies of scale naturally reward larger states with more efficiency and power than smaller states. The natural incentive is to grow and merge. This must be resisted and rejected at the most fundamental levels possible in order to protect the integrity of true democracy. Remember, every time I say true democracy, it's in italics. It's a proper noun in this book to mean something different. To protect the integrity of true democracy by consent of the governed. As systems grow and merge, the ruling class disproportionately benefit and everyone else is disempowered. This creates a positive feedback loop resulting in even more growth and merging and even more disempowerment. This disempowerment is often marketed by appealing to the added convenience and lower prices brought about by efficiency. All too often, people trade their power for a literal free lunch, and in the end, they get neither power nor a free lunch. Undervalued individual power, overestimated benefits of submission, and unaccounted for costs drive people into dependence, slavery, and the loss of government of the people, by the people, and for the people. I think I object to the usage of the word slavery in that sentence. Because if you trade your power for a free lunch, that's consensual. There is no slavery involved. I think that word's probably a little too far in that context. Mimicking biology. One of the ways to gain wisdom is to study nature. In nature, you don't see individual cells growing to the size of an elephant. Instead, cell size is limited and multiple cells cooperate to create larger organisms. Like cells, you don't see elephants getting bigger and bigger. You see herds of elephants. Furthermore, you don't see just one species of animal, you see millions or billions. Life is organized into hierarchies of independent life forms working together. Any cell that grows unrestrained will starve because the ratio of the cell membrane to the interior volume shrinks and it can't get enough food in or waste out. Animals that grow too big die for similar weight and energy density reasons. Likewise, societies of people that grow too big are not sustainable by nature. If we want to build a sustainable human civilization, then it should be composed of independent communities, which are themselves composed of independent sub-communities. In this way, errors are localized and systems are redundant. Your body can tolerate the corruption of some cells. A community can survive the corruption of some people. A state can survive the corruption of some counties, and the world can survive the corruption of some states. However, if the world is comprised of a single state, then the people cannot survive its corruption. Individual corruption is inevitable, which is why redundancy and diversity of communities are critical to the evolutionary success of the human species. The organization of people into an indivisible government limits the diversity of thinking and makes all of society susceptible to the same pathogens. It is like a monoculture farm. A single disease will kill everything. Large monoculture governments will be governed by fallible humans who can and will mandate one-size-fits-all solutions. These governments are unable to adapt to the changing natural environment and tend to over-specialize for the status quo. When something changes, it's game over. Imagine a giant domino the height of the Empire State Building. Now imagine attempting to knock it over with a single regular-sized domino. It isn't likely to happen. And you can look at the cover of the book on the screen. Oh, which I have messed up, actually. Oh, no! Let me fix that real quick. I just realized that. I got it wrong. Didn't even look. Not that anybody's looking at the screen this whole time. There we go. That's what it's supposed to look like. Anyway, you can see the cover of the book for the domino analogy that we're about to read. Imagine a giant domino the height of the Empire State Building. Now imagine attempting to knock it over with a single regular-sized domino. It isn't likely to happen. However, if you have a series of progressively larger dominoes lined up, then a single traditional domino can fall and knock over a slightly larger domino, which in turn knocks over a larger one, until finally, after just 29 dominoes, one the size of the Empire State Building falls. This occurs because of the exponential release of stored energy. A society structured with 1 million people electing one person to office, typical congressman, is like having the Empire State Building surrounded by 1 million uncoordinated ordinary dominoes. The combined energy of those ordinary dominoes cannot affect change by toppling the empire. Remember, 2 people working together are stronger than the sum of their individual contributions. Structuring society as a series of progressively larger independent dominoes maximizes the power of one person, a single domino, to affect change locally and therefore to affect change globally. A single person can affect change in their family. A family can affect change among their friends. A group of families can affect change in their church. A church can affect change in their town, etc. All of this is only possible if each scale of domino is independent and able to fall, change on its own. If all of the dominoes are physically linked to the largest domino, then nothing can happen without everything changing at once. What we learn from this is that an individual has maximum power when acting under a series of nested, independent layers of governance. To understand how this amplification of individual power arises, consider the following. Hold on. The market is the closest thing to a success. I mean, that is a successful system that mirrors the one that he was saying doesn't work, like where you have maybe a monolithic product, let's say, that's produced by a single monopolistic company, and you have 1 million individual people in the market. They could do things like boycott or create a new company to compete, which would then shift the supply and demand curves away from the powerful monopoly. Like when all those individuals are free to act in their own self-interest, as long as they're free to act in their own self-interest, then the big monopoly can't withstand the ocean of people under it in any kind of voluntary way. What we learn from this is that an individual has maximum power when acting under a series of nested independent layers of governance. To understand how this amplification of individual power arises, consider the following. When any small group is able to reach a 67% consensus, it gets to act with the power of 100%. This is a 50% increase in numeric power in addition to the fact that 1 + 1 is much more powerful than 2. When any small group is able to reach a 67% consensus, it gets to act with the power of 100%. What happens to the consent of the remaining 33%? I guess we're gonna let's find out. The amplification of individual power is even greater if a group allows decisions to be made with 51% consensus. This process also works in reverse. If the empire domino wants to prevent itself from being toppled, it can divide other dominoes into smaller dominoes, applying a small amount of energy to prevent 2 of 3 people from coming together and acting as 3 of 3 effective. Let me try that again. Applying a small amount of energy to prevent 2 of 3 people from coming together and acting as 3 of 3 effectively counters the power of well over 3 people acting alone. Dividing families and races are very powerful means of suppressing people's ability to topple tyrannies. That was a low-key powerful point. I'm going to read it again. Applying a small amount of energy to prevent 2 of 3 people from coming together and acting as 3 of 3 effectively counters the power of well over 3 people acting alone. Dividing families and races are very powerful means of suppressing people's ability to topple tyrannies. When the government offers couples incentives to split up by undermining a previously interdependent relationship with welfare and child support, it weakens everyone and empowers the state. The collateral damage goes far beyond just the couple, the children, and the welfare involved. A truly democratic society needs to encourage and reward committed long-term relationships and strong families. The strength of the resulting families is fundamental to protecting the individuals within the families against those who would benefit from their division. The key is to keep the dominoes independent, such that they can choose whether to continue their membership in a larger federation or leave. If a state cannot easily and peacefully secede from the United States, then the citizens of the state are unable to topple their domino. This means that there needs to be much stronger separation of powers between towns, counties, states, and international federations of states. True democracy is about empowering people to live in a community that empowers everyone maximally. It must conform with our biological and tribal natures, or the result will be everyone controlled by a ruling tribe that itself conforms to Dunbar's research. This means even the ruling class has scalability constraints, resulting in billions being controlled by mere hundreds. Next chapter, Coupling and Encapsulation. If you have ever worked at a large company, then you have probably experienced the chaos that occurs when people bypass the chain of command in either direction. An organization can become unstable when the CEO skips all of his managers and gives direct orders to the engineers, or a sales representative bypasses the middle management to report directly to the CFO. A more taboo example is when the CEO is in an intimate relationship with an entry-level employee. In all cases, the authority and, quote, independence of the middle management have been undermined. This problem can be even more complicated if a company is a conglomerate of many smaller companies, each of which is largely operating with autonomy. Bypassing the chain of command can dissolve the intended autonomy of sub-organizations, create hidden dependencies, and even expose organizations to legal liability. In a democratic society following the rules of relative power, it is critical that everyone follow the chain of command in order to ensure that the people retain the power that gives the government legitimacy. As we look at how this plays out, you will start to understand how dino empires co-opt the power from the people by violating the chain of command. I left my office door open, fair warning, because it's beautiful outside and there's a breeze coming through the house and I got the windows open. But we may be interrupted here in a minute. Who should have authority to collect taxes from an individual? Their local community, their state, the federal government, or all of the above? How about no one? How about no one? Taxes, okay, so this may be another definitional difference between he and I, but there has never been a consensual tax in existence ever. So when the question is asked, who should have the authority to collect taxes, you're asking who should have the authority to do something involuntary to people. The answer is a flat no across the board. If he's talking about consensual taxes, then again, he's talking about something that is new and has never existed. And I would even say is a contradiction in terms. I think if we're going to complain about the language being manipulated and jammed by people trying to fuzz it up and control us by making changes to it, I think we need to realize the true nature of the words we're using and not try and use them in new ways without sort of explicitly stating as much. Like it's kind of like we're doing the same thing in the other direction. Who should have authority to collect taxes from an individual? Their local community, their state, their federal government, or all of the above? We currently live in a world where it is all of the above, and that is a massive breach of community sovereignty and independence. Community doesn't have sovereignty. It's a concept. It's a group of individuals. So we currently live in a world where it is all of the above, and that's a massive breach of individual sovereignty and independence. But it's not the fact that it's all of the above that makes it a breach of sovereignty and independence. It's the reason is because it's non-consensual at the individual level, the only level where consent exists. Maybe I'm quibbling, but I think these are important details to tease out. Let's use an analogy to describe the importance of respecting the chain of command. Imagine a democracy of states is like a democracy of people. Now imagine that the government of a democracy of people had the right to directly tax the cells of the bodies of the people. I am recording right now. Do you need something?
Are you already downstairs?
I'm not going to talk about that right now. I'm recording. Let's use an analogy to describe the importance of respecting the chain of command. Imagine a democracy of states is like a democracy of people. Now, imagine that the government of a democracy of people had the right to directly tax the cells of the bodies of the people. You would have to question the sanity of any individual agreeing to a peace treaty where someone else got to take even partial control over your body's cells. Well, I would question the sanity of any individual agreeing to a treaty where somebody else got to take from them, no matter at what level it was. The cells now have two masters, your brain and the government, which is run by someone else's brain. Things start to look like a scene from The Matrix, where humanity has been enslaved by the machines who directly extract energy, aka power. AKA power. Energy is power. Kind of another way of using or thinking about the word power in the book. From every person while controlling their senses. The individual brain is living in a simulated reality where it pretends to have autonomy, but the real body is chained, weak, dependent, and sapped of all surplus energy. In this way, states pretend they have autonomy, but their body, the people living in the state, is chained, weak, dependent, and sapped of all surplus energy by the IRS. Yes. If no sane person would voluntarily sign a peace treaty where they give up control of their body parts, then why would any sane community sign a peace treaty where they give up control of their members? The reason that people formed the community was for mutual defense of their rights. So a community government that cedes control of its members to outside influences is derelict in its responsibility and has itself lost democratic legitimacy. We have to be careful because there are valid ways to talk about groups of people that have that are consensually acting together, and for the most part, that's what all of the collectivizing words in that paragraph sort of intended. But human brains are slippery in that, you know, you can use these collectivizing concepts like community valid 9 times, and then the 10th time, just because you're so used to talking about community as a thing that acts with the consent of the people, you'll slip and 1 out of 10 times use the word community in a way as if the thing itself existed and acted in the world and consented. This is probably why I'm just such a pedantic, annoying person about collectivizing words. Rather than talk about a community acting, I'll just say the people in the community act. I'll just say the people, the individuals in the community act, or something like that. Like, just to clarify every word. I like to not, rather than worry about the 1 out of 10 and then use it 9 out of 10 times the rest of the time. Okay. I just 10 out of 10 times, I try and talk about individuals. It's safer that way. So a community government that cedes control of its members to outside influences. When you say that with more accurate or more precise language, that would be, so a group of people that cede control of themselves to outside influences is derelict in their responsibility and has itself lost democratic legitimacy. Yeah, see, that's why my brain tries to transpose this stuff in real time just to make sure it makes sense, because it's easy to reify these collectivistic terms into entities that act or hold beliefs or hold opinions or can, for instance, in this example, have responsibilities and democratic legitimacy. I'm not saying there's anything necessarily wrong with this paragraph, just saying that, I would need to sort of parse through it very carefully. When I see the word community used like 6 times in a paragraph, it makes me want to slow down and read it again. So I'm going to do that. And this time I'm going to try and read the paragraph again, transposing for more precise language. If no sane person would voluntarily sign a peace treaty where they give up control of their body parts, then why would any sane group of people act together to sign a peace treaty where they give up control of themselves? The reason that people came together was for mutual defense of their rights. So a group of people that cedes control of themselves to outside influences is derelict are derelict in their responsibility and have themselves lost democratic legitimacy. So when you put it that way, it does seem to be a problem, because if a person has the right to sign a treaty that gives up control over themselves or their property, they have that right. Each of us have that right. It may be dumb, but they have that right. So in what way could somebody utilizing their rights make them derelict? Like, what responsibility are they derelict in? Democratic legitimacy? Is that important? I think that should be established. In what way has an individual that has signed a peace treaty to give up their control of themselves? What? I don't know. I don't think this democratic legitimacy responsibility thing matches. Could be missing something. I'll think about it more. Welcome to Patrick's pedantic brain. A democracy of states should know nothing about the composition of the states. From a computer science perspective, the fact that states are composed of counties and that counties are composed of towns, which are composed of people, is an implementation detail. At a federal level, the peace treaty is a democracy of states where each state is an equal. Now, consider how this would work from a tax collection point of view. If the state-to-state peace treaty calls for the parties to contribute to federal funding, then that funding must come from the member with the member's consent. This means that an individual person should never have any interaction with the federal government unless acting as an elected, appointed representative of a state. All federal taxes should be billed to the states, and each state must have autonomy in deciding how to raise the money to pay the tax. This structure ensures that a state can collectively choose to secede without changing anything about its tax structure, and without individuals having to worry about whether or not to pay federal taxes. I don't know. I think in practice, this idea would be not not fractured in a single layer. I think you would have just all sorts of one of two things, and it's probably a little of both. One, you're going to have groups. The overall, just let me organize my thoughts and then open my mouth. So taking taxes, for example, assuming that they're now voluntary, which aren't taxes, but let's just use the word tax, I guess, because that's what's in the book. Just to take that issue on its own, the individuals or the states, the consensual groups of people, they would be hopefully so ready to secede that it would be very difficult to propose any quote tax at the state or federal level, at the higher up level at all, for fear of the secession, which would be an amazing thing. Like if people are free to walk away, even down to the individual, then immediately, step one, things like money being required of all the members will, the amounts of that and the frequency of that requirement will be severely reduced. Like, think about like any club that you're a part of. Clubs will have a membership fee, but the membership fees are going to be pretty low because the members are there voluntarily, and if the fees are too high, if people don't feel like the fees are justified, then they just won't be part of your club, and your club will wither and die or be outcompeted by another club that has lower fees. And so there's a very strong pressure on, especially like volunteer organizations, to have low fees. One example would be, I was a volunteer for years for, I shouldn't mention the name of the club, but it was a charity organization, let's just say that. And it did really good work, really rare work. Not a lot of people could do the type of charity work that this organization does. Very difficult work, very emotional work, challenging work. So they were constantly bereft of and hurting for members, volunteers, people that had the skill to do this and the emotional fortitude to do it. And yet, like, I was drawn to do the work because I had the skills and the fortitude, and I was impressed by the magnitude of the benefit that they could provide people. Trying to provide as much context as possible without getting too much into it. But when I found out how and attempted to join, they said, okay, well, new members, there's a fee of $500. And I just balked. I'm here to volunteer, to give my time freely to a charity, and you want me to pay $500 for the privilege of giving you my time for free? Like, that is backwards. Anyway, so if you think about these governance structures that this book is talking about, them being voluntary, they're going to want members because the members will make their dominoes weigh more, so to speak, right? And so to attract the members that can leave at any time, they're not going to implement $500 membership fees, for example. Interesting to think about. So there will be some balance. I guess what I meant was there's gonna evolve some balance between number of different groups of states or different groups of communities coming together. Some that are more okay with quote tax requirements, and others that are less okay with tax requirements. And hopefully you'd be able to choose which one to live in. I think the geographic restriction's a problem for that, but the other point I wanted to make is that I think it'll fracture at different levels, which is an interesting thing to think about. I'm not sure if it's covered. I'm not sure if it's even thought of or discussed in the book, but you could potentially have. Let's talk about it at the state level, just for clarity. Quote unquote state level. You'll have one grouping of states. Let's say high, medium, low on the tax topic or the tax issue. You'll have a group of states that are okay with contributing more in voluntary taxes to pay for X, Y, and Z things, and you'll have another group of states medium contribution, another group of states low contribution. on the tax issue, for example, for whatever the tax, the quote unquote voluntary taxes go for. Then you might have a different grouping of the same states along collectivized defense lines. You might have a totally different combination of those same states that are organized into a strong defense resources, medium defense resources, weak defense resources. Like, I'm not sure if the book thinks about that, but you could have each sort of layer of service that you would want from grouping up with other people. Each one of those different silos or verticals, it wouldn't all have to be like locked into a single geographical grouping party, so to speak. It could be, you could take what you want and pay for it from each category as an individual, maybe even. And the more of that you have, the more competition you have. And the more alternatives and competitors you have, which might be good. Anyway, my brain's just going off. Who knows? Okay. Let me just start over in this paragraph so I make sure I not miss anything. Now consider how this would work from a tax collection point of view. If the state-to-state peace treaty calls for the parties to contribute to federal funding, then that funding must come from the member with the member's consent. This means that an individual person should never have any interaction with the federal government unless acting as an elected or appointed representative of a state. All federal taxes should be billed to the states, and each state must have autonomy in deciding how to raise the money to pay the tax. This structure ensures that a state can collectively choose to secede without changing anything about its tax structure. I really think we need new words for all of these things that have always been coercive. Every single concept in this book uses words that have always meant nothing other than coercive concepts, and I think he's using all of them in a new, voluntary, non-coercive way. So let's. I don't think tax is the way to go either. All right, sorry. This structure ensures that a state can collectively choose to secede without changing anything about its tax structure and without individuals having to worry about whether or not to pay federal taxes. This idea was understood in part by the drafters of the United States Constitution, which stated that direct taxes had to be apportioned among the states, and it was for the purpose of apportionment that we have a consensus. The concept of apportionment is an anti-democratic concept, which is similar in principle to stating that each person's vote should be proportional to their weight on a scale, or that their percent of total taxes paid should be based upon the number of cells in their body. In effect, apportionment says that some people are more equal than others, whereas democracy is supposed to be among equals, voluntarily agreeing to a peace treaty under the law of the jungle. I call it state of nature. He calls it law of the jungle. I think we mean the same thing. I haven't seen any indication that we don't. So if you've listened to me for any amount of time and you've heard me talk about the state of nature, I'm pretty sure that's what he's talking about. In a truly democratic system, one negotiated among equals, all parties have an equal vote, equal obligations, and equal benefits. All states would have equal taxes. A state like California would have to divide if its people wanted extra influence, but doing so would cause it to pay extra dues. Dues. You should have said dues this whole time instead of taxes. That's the word. In this way, dues are still apportioned by population, but only with matching autonomy. This protects the smaller states from the collusion of California's population. Imagine if the United Nations had the authority to pass an income tax that applied to all people in the world. It would directly undermine the autonomy of the United States. Today, the United States and other countries fund the United Nations collectively, and each country can decide to leave and withdraw funding as a single entity. Even here, funding is not uniform. The United States pays 70%, which gives certain countries more influence over the United Nations. Federal taxation of individuals undermines the privacy and independence of state and county governments. It extracts wealth directly from lower levels of government, the people, and then uses it to extort state and local compliance. For example, the federal government can withhold funding for schools, roads, and police unless the states conform. The states have had their independence undermined by allowing the federal government to use the people's resources against the state. With the funds already taken from the people by the federal government, the state's people, e.g., citizens of Virginia, lack the funds to set up independent schools if they disagree with the Department of Education. And that's struck through indoctrination. Department of Indoctrination. It becomes much harder for the people of one state to organize a tax strike if the state is not already in control of the tax cash flow. Let's take this to an extreme. What would happen if the federal government implemented a 90% income tax on the people and then gave the state government's funding contingent upon compliance? Furthermore, assume there were no deductions allowed for state and local taxes. How much money would be left for state governments to tax? Do state governments have any autonomy or ability to represent the people? Would any formerly independent state agree to such terms in advance? If no one would agree to those terms in advance, then what legitimacy can exist in a system that arrived there incrementally? The purpose of the state government is to represent the county governments, and the purpose of the county governments is to represent the people in the county. An individual has far more representation within his local county than he does across an entire federation of states, composed of hundreds of millions of people. It is possible for people to reach consensus within their county, and that consensus gives everyone in the county more power. Their county has far more power to negotiate with the state as a unified front of 50,000 co-located people than if 50,000 uncoordinated people wanted to achieve the same influence. This is a situation of how two people working together can overcome two people operating without coordination. The effective power of each member of a larger society is greatest when organized into smaller composable units. Case study: Virginia gun rights. This case study involves a trigger issue for many people. Please take a moment to separate the concept from your personal opinions on guns, and remember we are investigating the process of reaching consensus in a true democracy. The predicted end result does not justify nor invalidate the means. The principles discussed by the case study also apply to other issues such as abortion, marijuana, and immigration, and in those issues, this process may favor your opinion. The state of Virginia has 8.5 million people organized into 95 counties. Most of the population is concentrated in urban areas where the prevailing party is the, quote, Democratic Party, which I will hereafter call the Dino, Democratic in name only. Democratic in name only party, because they do not adhere to the principles of a true democracy. Because Virginia is not a democracy of counties, the state government ends up controlled by the Dino Party. The Dino Party advocates disarming the people, which is something that 96% of the counties in Virginia are actively against based upon actual resolutions passed by local governments. If Virginia were a democracy of counties, then the result would be vastly different. The entire state would recognize an individual right to bear arms. The individuals in 96% of the counties would have their rights better protected. Those individuals living in counties that favor banning guns could secede and form their own state, or join with other counties in Maryland. However, that is unlikely to be necessary because a democracy of counties shouldn't actually care about individual gun rights so much as the independence of the county itself. This means that if Loudoun County, I don't know how to pronounce that, Loudoun? Who knows? This means that if Loudoun County, I'm going to say it like a Texan, wanted to ban guns internally, then Floyd County wouldn't care. Like taxes, regulations should not bypass the intermediate governments. A democracy of counties would be more concerned about each county's right to form a militia. A democracy of states would care about each state's right to form a national guard, and a democracy of countries would be concerned about each country's right to have its own military. If the United States won't give up its right to have a military to the United Nations, then why should the states give up their right to a national guard to the federal government? The counties give up their right to a militia to the state, or the individuals give up their right to self-defense to the county. Global majority rules. If democracy was about subjugating the minority, weak, to the will of the majority, strong, then China should rule the United States. It certainly doesn't follow that a country of 320 million people should operate global empire coercing, should operate. Maybe we're missing a word here. It certainly doesn't follow that a country of 320 million people should operate global empire, coercing, I think, a global empire, coercing the other 7 billion with threats of regime change. China shouldn't control the United States any more than California should control Virginia, or any more than Richmond should control Floyd County, or any more than a plantation owner should control his slaves. Stated another way, the Dino Party, with 51% by population, shouldn't control the Rhino, Republicans in name-only party, any more than the Rhinos should control the Dinos, if they had 51%. Party politics is similar in nature to mixing the population of Russia and the United States in the same territory, while the people maintain their Russian and American, quote, identity, and every year we have to choose whether we elect a Russian or American as president over everyone. I think that was a great analogy. I'm going to read that again. Party politics is similar in nature to mixing the population of Russia and the United States in the same territory, while the people maintain their Russian and American identity, and every year we have to choose whether we elect a Russian or American as president over everyone. Only under the law of the jungle does it make sense for the 51% to rule over the 49. In fact, under the law of the jungle, it is legitimate for 51% to kill the 49. What? And it is also legitimate under the law of the jungle for 1% to kill the 99, if they had the power to do so. Yeah, there is no legitimacy. Yeah, I think he made that point. What is the difference between 51% threatening to kill the 49% if they don't comply, and 51% threatening to kill the 49 if they don't comply, and What is the difference between 51% threatening to kill the 49 if they don't comply, and 51% actually killing them? If the 51% don't actually believe in genocide or the threat thereof, then it follows that they should allow the 49% to secede. There is a strong temptation for those in the 51% group on an issue to advocate universal application of their theories on how to run society. What do they have to lose? The law of the jungle is on their side. There is a well-known saying, "First they came for the communists, and I did not speak out, because I was not a communist. Then they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out, because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out, because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out, because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me." The idea is that siding with the majority works until one day you are no longer the majority. Regardless of your belief system, you will not always be in the majority. It would be foolish to adopt a belief system that serves you today but which justifies your death tomorrow. Lessons from software engineering. Secession is much more difficult if the structure of government fails to follow the principles of low coupling and strong encapsulation. I have spent a career developing complex software and, quote, blockchain operating systems. Governance could be viewed as nothing more than an operating system for society. From a computer programmer's perspective, you want to organize code into functions, functions into classes, classes into libraries, libraries into programs, programs into operating systems into intranets, and intranets into the internet. Failure to modularize your code and to respect proper APIs, interfaces, produces, quote, spaghetti code that is impossible to maintain, debug, reuse, or upgrade. The result is bugs, corruption of data, and slower development. It is usually faster to rewrite a program from scratch than to fix spaghetti code. Spaghetti governments almost always have to collapse and are rarely able to reform. To avoid the problems of spaghetti code, developers follow the principle of modularity, geographic grouping, low coupling, separation of powers, dependency minimization, independence, and hiding of implementation details from the public interface, separating federal government from the people. A stable, complex society would be wise to follow some of these same design principles. This way, if there is a bug in one area, it doesn't bring down all of society. I think I will leave the reading there for today. The next chapter is called The Power of Randomness. I really like this chapter. It's one of the coolest things that I would consider new thought in the area of organizing people. I really think the bug in this whole thing is the geographical grouping, because that severely weakens one's property rights. Not saying it's wrong. I'm saying I need to give it more thought because I see it as a problem. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've enjoyed this this reading, number 2. We are about 30% through the book. Plenty to go. Plenty of good stuff. If you're liking it, let me know. I will catch you guys next time. Have a great evening. That sounded retarded. Have a great evening, and I mean that. Have a great evening.